At 6, MPs have voted to prevent the immediate suspension of a Conservative MP accused of breaking lobbying rules. To cries of shame, they narrowly voted through measures to shake up the rules on MPs' behaviour. An investigation had found Owen Paterson used his position to benefit two companies he worked for. Labour called today's vote a return to Tory sleaze.
When they break the rules, Mr. Speaker, they just remake the rules.
Yeah. I think that she needs to consider the procedures of this House in a spirit of fairness.
Tonight, Owen Paterson said after 2 years of hell, he now has the chance to clear his name. Also on the programme. Tackling global warming, the Chancellor says he wants the UK to show the world how finance and business can play their part in reducing emissions. The racism row at Yorkshire County Cricket Club. Now major sponsors withdraw their support over the way former player Azim Rafiq was treated. And missing in Australia for 18 days, the moment a 4-year-old is rescued from a house by police after she'd vanished from a campsite.
And coming up on Sports Day later in the hour on the BBC News channel, pressure's ramping up on Yorkshire County Cricket Club over their handling of Azim Rafiq's complaints of racial harassment and bullying.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. A Conservative MP who was found to have broken lobbying rules won't be suspended for now after MPs narrowly voted to look at an overhaul of their disciplinary process. An investigation by the Parliamentary Standards Watchdog had ruled that former Minister Owen Paterson should be suspended for 6 weeks for repeatedly lobbying ministers and officials for two companies paying him more than £100,000 a year. But today's vote means his suspension is halted for now. Downing Street insists the move is about the fairness of the system, not one individual case. But Labour called it an absolute disgrace and accused the government of breaking and then remaking the rules. Here's our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
How much faith do you place in politicians to police themselves? Today, the government backed changes which could give MPs accused of wrongdoing a new right of appeal. Labour say this looks like the government's watering down the system that's supposed to tackle sleaze and could further widen the gulf between politicians and the public.
This isn't about playing politics in this place. This is about playing by the rules. Yeah! And as we can see, it's one rule for everybody else and one rule for the Tory Conservatives. When they break the rules, Mr. Speaker, they just remake the rules.
But Boris Johnson insisted the government simply wanted to give MPs the same rights as any other people accused of professional wrongdoing.
May I respectfully say to her that I believe that she needs to focus, instead of playing politics on this issue, which is what they are doing. I think that she needs to consider the procedures of this House in a spirit of fairness.
And this is what the row is all about. Labour accused the government of acting to help this man, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Owen Paterson. An investigation by the independent parliamentary watchdog found that he'd broken rules on lobbying. A cross-party committee of MPs said as a result he should be suspended from the House of Commons for 30 days. But that action has now been put on hold while changes to the system are being considered. Owen Paterson has said that a 2-year stressful investigation was a contributory factor in his wife taking her own life. But he's also had other complaints about how the investigation was carried out, that he had no right of appeal, no ability to call witnesses in his own defence. So now, a committee of Conservative MPs are looking at making changes accordingly. Critics say this shows favouritism and will further undermine public confidence in Parliament.
If the public believe that we are marking our own homework, our reputation individually and collectively will be tarnished. Independence is essential to protect us.
Reform can only work if it's across the House, and by bringing her amendment today, it looks like we're moving the goalpost.
But the government maintain they're not showing Owen Paterson special favours. The issues raised by his case reflect more widespread concern amongst MPs about whether the current anti-sleaze system gives them a fair hearing.
I think the reason it has come now is because of the volume of complaints that have come through and the more widespread feeling of unfairness across all benches that have been brought to my attention and the attention of others. In very simplistic, cliched terms, this is the famous straw that has broken the long-suffering camel's back.
Public trust in politicians remains low, and critics say that to be seen to be writing their own rule book won't do anything to restore it, but the government would argue that changes are long overdue. Well, Sophie, tonight the cross-party consent on the way that complaints against MPs are handled appears to be lying in tatters, because in the last half hour, Labour have confirmed, along with the SNP, that they will not take part in any discussions with the Conservatives about changing parliamentary rules. In fact, they're actually relishing the prospect of portraying the government as soft on sleaze. But I reckon Boris Johnson's calculation is this, that in the wider world, away from Westminster, people are far more worried about their own jobs and prospects than those of members of Parliament.
Ian Watson, thank you. The Chancellor says he wants the UK to set an example to the world in how finance and business can play their part in tackling global warming. At the Climate Change Summit in Glasgow, Rishi Sunak said major British companies would have until 2023 to set out how they intend to hit climate change targets, but they would not be legally required to hit those targets. Our economics editor Faisal Islam reports.
Follow the money to net zero. That was the plan revealed at the ongoing climate change talks in Glasgow, with time ticking for the world's finance ministers and bankers gathered in the audience.
Good morning and welcome to COP26 Finance Day.
The main result, the world's banks, pension funds and insurers promising to invest and lend in a way consistent with net zero by 2050. That's £95 trillion of funds, or 2/5 of the whole of global finance. So those in suits are today's eco-warriors, says the president of the summit.
Today, the swampies of the world are all around us. In boardrooms, in government departments, in multilateral development banks and trading floors, all around the world. You, my friends, are the new swampies, so be proud.
Can it really be the case that these guys, the bankers and financiers, can save the world from climate change? That's the hope underlying these incredible numbers, that the lending decisions to businesses large and small will transform entire sectors, from energy to transport, from food to retail. And for politicians, this is a lot more palatable than telling consumers, voters, that their behaviour has to change. One British bank chief from the institution that funded North Sea oil and gas told the BBC that tough conversations in these sectors where carbon emissions were difficult to limit were already happening.
We're very clear that we are ending funding of harmful activity, and we will only work with people with a credible transition plan aligned with Paris, because actually if all that happens is that the hard to abate sectors get financed in the private sector without transparency, you haven't met the goal of taking the carbon out of the economy.
The announcements made this morning will discourage finance going to new coal mines or oil fields, for example, but they won't absolutely prevent such flows. Rich nations have also delayed long-promised funds for poorer countries to help with climate change.
The International Energy Agency has come out and said that to get to 1.5, we need to cease all new fossil fuel financing. These commitments today don't add up to that, so we need to see further ambition on moving our investments away from brown into green.
Why are you doing tax breaks for fossil fuel companies?
Green campaigners were crying foul directly to the Chancellor on the site of the negotiations. He acclaimed the UK at the centre of a tidal wave of global green banking, the hope that the carrot of cheap finance, rather than the stick of tough regulations, is the answer for the world. Faisal Islam, BBC News.
Companies around the world are making environmental pledges, but can and will they deliver them? Take Shell, for example, one of the biggest oil companies in the world. Its boss insists they're on course to halve their own emissions over the next decade. He's been speaking to our business editor, Simon Jack, at the company's biggest oil refinery in the Netherlands.
20 million tonnes of oil a year flow through Pernis, the largest refinery in Europe. Globally, Shell has a carbon footprint the size of Russia's.
What you see here is predominantly refinery. There's a bit of
Chief Executive Ben van Beurden said Shell's transition to net zero is possible, but it will need the money from its oil and gas business for many years to pay for it.
This facility is going to be transformed. We will produce biofuels, where we will produce hydrogen over the horizon. All these things can only be done if you actually have a facility to work with, but also if you have the cash to invest with it. And that cash at this point in time comes from our legacy business.
But it's not all legacy. Shell wants to develop a new oil field at Cambo in the North Sea. How does he justify that?
So to just say, let's not get oil and gas demands from our own resources, that are probably the most advantaged resources, but let's import it from somewhere else, probably with a larger carbon footprint. I don't think that is going to contribute, of course, not to the balance of payments of the country, but also not to the carbon footprint of the world.
Shell plans to spend 4 times as much on oil and gas as on renewables next year, which is why some doubt it can obey a Dutch court order to halve its net emissions by 2030 and eliminate them by 2050.
Even if you are very generous and assume they get all the amounts of carbon capture and storage and offsets that they need, they might just miss their 2030 targets and they will not be able to deliver on 2050. In fact, they will be increasing emissions till 2030 and still be producing a significant amount of emissions in 2050.
Van Beurden insists Shell's own emissions are on track.
Compared to 2016, which is our reference year, we have reduced emissions already with 17%. And we are on track to get to minus 50% by 2030. That is just going to be measured, it's going to be put in scorecards, and part of my bonus is going to be dependent on us meeting that.
Remember, these targets don't include emissions from customers using Shell products. That's 90% of the total footprint.
This gigantic oil refinery is changing to make less carbon-intensive products. Now, that won't be good or fast enough for some people. We'd probably like to see it shut down tomorrow. But our lives are still very much entwined with industries like this. And in fact, if you have a pension, you own shares in Shell and BP. But there are those who think we should be withdrawing our financial backing for industries like this.
But just selling up and walking away would be a mistake, according to the world's biggest money manager.
We can't have that dialogue with companies if we're not invested in them. By being invested in the companies, we have that seat at the table, we engage with them. We can't divest from the world.
As powerful as Shell is, customers may be more powerful. As long as there's demand for fossil fuels, Shell or someone else will supply it. Simon Jack, BBC News, Rotterdam.
Pressure is growing on Yorkshire County Cricket Club over its handling of allegations of racism by former player Azim Rafiq. An investigation found that Mr Rafiq had been the victim of racial harassment and bullying, but the club said no disciplinary action would be taken. This afternoon, several of the club's major sponsors said they were withdrawing their support. Our sports editor Dan Owen is outside Headingley, and the pressure really intensifying tonight.
Absolutely, Sophie, yes. I mean, this club, the most successful in the history of the county game, was already under serious scrutiny over the fact that it had taken no action against any current employee or player, despite the fact that, as you say, an independent panel had found that Rafiq had suffered racial harassment and bullying during his spell here as a player. But then the scrutiny got a lot worse this week when there was a leak of the report and there was a claim that a current player used a racially offensive term towards Rafiq repeatedly, which made reference to his Pakistani heritage, but that the panel deemed it friendly banter and therefore no action was taken against that player. That sparked outcry from senior politicians and ministers, some of whom condemned the club's handling of this case. The chairman has been summoned to appear in front of a parliamentary committee in 2 weeks. Also due to give evidence there will be Rafiq himself. That could be very uncomfortable if more revelations come forward. And today, financial consequences to a host of sponsors, including Emerald, whose name adorns this stadium, and Yorkshire Tea as well, cutting ties with the club. It's the gravest crisis, some say, in the county's 160-year history.
Dan Roan, thank you. The time is very nearly 6:15, our top story this evening. MPs have voted to prevent the immediate suspension of a Conservative MP accused of breaking lobbying rules. And coming up, Liverpool's captain Jordan Henderson visits the healthcare workers who benefited from his charity work during the pandemic.
Coming up on Sports Day in the next 15 minutes on the BBC News channel on a busy night in the Champions League. We'll get the latest from Anfield, where Liverpool can progress to the last 16 if they beat the Spanish champions, Atletico Madrid.
A 4-year-old girl who was missing for 18 days in Australia has been rescued by police. Cleo Smith disappeared in the middle of the night at a remote campsite during a family holiday. The search for her gripped Australia. Police finally found her locked in a house near her home in Western Australia. A 36-year-old man is now being questioned by detectives. Our correspondent Shaima Khalil sent this report from Sydney.
Hiya, my name's Cameron. How are you? Are you okay? We're going to take you to see your mummy and daddy, okay?
This is the moment Cleo Smith was rescued. Found in one of the rooms in a locked house. Not far from her family home in the Western Australian town of Carnarvon. One of the officers described the moment they found her as one of shock and elation.
I wanted to be absolutely sure it was her, so I said, "What's your name?" And she didn't answer, and I said, "What's your name?" She didn't answer again. So I asked her the third time, and then she looked at me and she said, "My name's Cleo."
After waiting more than 2 weeks, this is a reunion her parents feared would not happen.
Mummy! Big hugs, kisses, yeah, and lots of tears, you know, so as you can expect, you know.
The 4-year-old vanished from her family's tent while camping on the Western Australian coast. It sparked one of the biggest police operations in the area, with extensive air, land and sea searches. $1 million reward was offered for information on her location. Cleo's disappearance gripped Australia. From day one, this story captured the nation's heart. Now that she's been rescued, so many people took to social media to express their joy and relief, including, of course, Cleo's mother, Ellie Smith. She said, "Our family is whole again." A 36-year-old man is in custody and is being questioned by detectives. More details have yet to emerge about how little Cleo disappeared and the events that led to her rescue. But for now, a family's ordeal is over and a country's prayers have been answered. Shaima Khalil, BBC News, Sydney.
More than 30 years after the Lockerbie bombing, Libya is considering extraditing a man wanted by the United States in connection with the terrorist attack, which killed 270 people. Libya's foreign minister has told the BBC positive outcomes are coming, and Libya is very open to collaborating on the question of extradition. The downing of the plane in 1988 remains the worst terrorist attack on British soil. Libya accepted responsibility in 2003 and paid compensation. From Tripoli, Orla Guerin reports a warning her piece contains flashing images.
On this dark night in 1988, the town of Lockerbie was engulfed in flames and horror. The wreckage of Pan Am 103 crashed to earth. Almost 33 years on, the US is pursuing a new Libyan suspect. Now, from the government in Tripoli, indications of progress.
There is positive outcomes coming. And might there be an extradition? Well, I don't know, but I think we as a government, we are very open in terms of collaboration in this matter. We understand the pain and the sadness of the victims and the families. We need to also respect the laws. But it's progressing, you think? Yes, it is.
The new suspect is Abu Ajayla Mohammed Massoud, who's already behind bars in Libya on separate bomb-making charges. The US alleges he conspired with a fellow intelligence official, Abdel Basser al-Magrahi, the only man ever convicted of the bombing. This was the hero's welcome for al-Magrahi in Libya in 2009. He was released from a Scottish prison with terminal cancer and died 3 years later, maintaining his innocence to his last breath. His son, Ali, told us everywhere he goes, he's labelled the Lockerbie bomber's son. Here they are together after Abdel Basser al-Magrahi's release. He says he won't stop trying to clear his father's name, despite 2 failed appeals.
When you tell me, after 32 years, you blame another person, this old story is fake. My father have nothing to do with all this. When I am going to fight to the end, I'm going to prove his innocent. I'm sure 100% I'm going to prove it in UK Supreme Court.
There's so much we will never know.
Across the Atlantic, Pan Am families say the whole truth may never come to light. But Cara Weeps, who lost her brother Rick Monetti, told us extraditing the new suspect would bring a measure of justice.
Here we are, and we have this chance to really see this come to fruition in our country, have someone tried under our laws in our courts. I don't know if I can even put into words what it would mean to the families and the amount of peace it would bring them.
Is the truth here in Libya? Are there more answers to come so many years after the attack? Maybe, maybe not. But Libya wants good relations with the US, and it wants an extradition. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Tripoli.
Here, the government's latest coronavirus figures for the UK show there were 41,299 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means on average there were 39,691 new cases reported per day in the last week. There were 9,517 people in hospital with COVID as of yesterday. 217 deaths were recorded. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive test. On average, in the past week, 163 COVID-related deaths were recorded every day. And more than 8.6 million people have received their booster jab. This includes third doses for those with certain health conditions. Well, there could be hard months to come in the fight against coronavirus. That's the warning from England's Deputy Chief Medical Officer. Professor Jonathan Van Tam said too many people believe the pandemic is over, even though infection rates in the UK are still very high. Our medical editor Fergus Walsh is here. Another warning about the winter months, given cases are so high still.
Indeed, Sophie. Jonathan Van Tam said it was a concern that COVID levels are running hot, as he put it. We've currently got around 1,000 COVID admissions to hospital every day. Now, that's a quarter of what we saw in January, but it's still significant. And although deaths are still comparatively low, they are creeping up. And it's very hard to predict where the numbers are going to go in the next 4 weeks, let alone the next 4 months. So much will depend on how cautious people are in terms of their behaviour on mixing and socialising, and how successful the booster campaign is. And the key message from Professor Van Tam was, if you're invited for your first, second or booster dose, or indeed for your flu vaccine, get the jab. We've hit the milestone now of 50 million people in the UK over the age of 12 having had at least one dose of COVID vaccine, but there's still around 5 million adults completely unvaccinated.
Fergus, thank you. The BBC has been told that Metropolitan Police officers facing misconduct allegations were allowed to go on patrol because of staff shortages. A former internal investigations officer claims he was told restrictions needed to be eased because the force did not have enough staff. But the Met says changes in restrictions are carefully considered. It comes as the Met's boss, Dame Cressida Dick, promised to restore trust with women in the wake of the murder of Sarah Everard. Our special correspondent Lucy Manning has this exclusive report.
The Met and its commissioner under pressure like never before, reeling from one of the worst incidents in its history and facing an inquiry. But tonight, new allegations about how the force investigates its own.
There are a lot of officers who are clear risk, not only to the victims, but to the organisation.
Jason Veron, for 10 years a Met officer, including time inside its internal investigations unit, the DPS, policing the police. But he claims with cuts to officers, he felt pressured to help reduce the restrictions faced by those under investigation by a senior officer known as the appropriate authority.
You recorded some of your fellow officers talking about the way cases were managed. What did that recording say?
It clearly shows the appropriate authority telling me there's too many officers on restriction and we do not have enough officers on the street of London. We're not going to sack everybody that comes to attention of DPS. We're only sacking the one that really deserves to be sacked.
In one case, an officer on an order to prevent domestic violence, who was then also accused of sexually harassing a woman, was allowed to go on patrol as long as he wore body-worn video. A second officer accused of assaulting a woman was also allowed to go on patrol if they kept their camera recording.
Within the DPS, there's numerous allegations. Is it appropriate, if I'm being accused, for me to go on the street, albeit with a body-worn video? And does members of the public want this kind of policing?
The investigator also says an officer in the Force's Sexual Offences Unit had relationships with multiple rape victims, and his investigation into him was plagued by interference.
So you claim you had pressure from senior officers, is that right?
That's correct. If you look at this detective inspector who was abusing his position to sleep with multiple victims of rape and sexual assault, there was commanders from the MPS telling me that I am doing a witch hunt investigation.
Mr Viren complained to the police watchdog 4 years ago, before leaving the force 2 years later. In August, it made 3 recommendations about how the Met could improve its internal investigations, saying there was confusion and a culture of mistrust, but said it found no evidence of corruption. The Met said allegations of misconduct are investigated robustly and expeditiously, and decisions on restrictions were carefully considered by a senior officer.
The rules are clear. If there have been cases where restrictions have been eased, it has not been to put more people out on the beat. It has been because that is the proportionate thing to do, the appropriate thing to do.
But the former investigator's allegations raise serious questions about the force's ability to police itself.
Either you accept and move on, or you resist and you get pushed out.
So do you believe there are officers on the street who are a risk to the public?
100%.
Jason Viren ending that report by Lucy Manning. Now, at the start of the pandemic, Liverpool's captain Jordan Henderson called on fellow footballers to donate a portion of their salary to help support healthcare workers on the front line. The initiative helped to raise millions of pounds. BBC Breakfast's Sally Nugent joined Jordan Henderson at Aintree University Hospital in Liverpool to meet some of the staff who have benefited.
Should I swap your mask? Yeah, get rid of that one.
Last year, at the start of the pandemic, Liverpool captain Jordan Henderson contacted footballers across the country to ask for help. He invited them to support the NHS by donating part of their wage. They raised millions of pounds. He's come to meet hospital staff in Liverpool to hear their experiences of working through a pandemic.
Hi everyone, you okay?
The amount of patients that were coming through that were a lot sicker than we're used to looking after. It was a bit of a challenging experience for all of the staff up there, and the support that we've had from NHS charities has meant that I can carry on being a functional human. You know, I'm not just Nurse Kate who gets completely exhausted at work. I've got the tools to live a functional life and be happy in my life, so I can't thank you enough.
Well, to be honest, I'm not here for you to thank me. I'm here to say thank you to all of you, you know, for what you have done. I can only imagine how tough it's been. So for us to give back just a little bit meant an awful lot to us, you know, and not just me, players at Liverpool, players across the Premier League, in the women's game as well.
It was a challenging time when actually there are loads of people from the care home that comes to A&E, all COVID one after the other. So in just a matter of like 1 week, we have loads of death. And then the hardest thing is that we cannot allow relatives to be with them because we have to take care of them. We have to protect them so that they won't get the virus.
According to research from NHS charities Together, 2/3 of staff have experienced problems with their mental health since the pandemic began.
What they've suffered is a form of trauma, really, and yeah, saying goodbye to loved ones and the families can't come in, and that could stay with them for a long time.
If staff were a bit upset or distressed, we'd take them through to this one-to-one room.
In the first couple of waves, it was just mayhem and chaos, and people needed to come in and draw a breath. Now people are absolutely knackered. They've given so much over the last year and a half, and we really need to look after them, help them nourish themselves, come back to health.
With the money raised by footballers across the UK, the aim is to protect the mental health of NHS staff now and in the future. Sally Nugent, BBC News.
Time now for a look at the weather with Susan Powell.
Thank you, Sophie. Good evening. A little chillier for us all tomorrow. Today, there was quite a bit of sunshine around, some showers draped around our western and eastern coasts. Tomorrow, the weather pattern will look very similar, but the wind is going to pick up. And right now, we have colder air already feeding its way south across the UK on a northerly wind. So it probably will come as no surprise that we are anticipating a frost tonight, anywhere really from central Scotland down into the Welsh Marches. I think to the east of the UK, enough of a breeze and still some showers around, our temperatures will hold up, but certainly a fairly extensive frost as we look further north and west. And then to start off Thursday daytime with clear skies, a lot of sunshine actually. The showers should be fewer and further between across eastern coastal counties through Thursday, but still a nagging wind down the North Sea coast, some showers feeding in here, a few getting into Kent and Essex as well, and still across Pembrokeshire and Cornwall, favoured spots for some fairly relentless showers. But overall, quite a lot of dry weather. Our temperatures just about making it into double figures. But look closely at this chart, and this front you see here is a warm weather front sneaking into the north of the UK as we look at the end of the week. And behind it, we're going to pull in more cloud, but high pressure is going to mean a lot of fine weather for Friday. So the plus side is, I think, slightly more overcast skies, but a warmer feel to proceedings. And that warmer feel is what we'll then take with us into the weekend as we continue with a westerly wind. A lot of fine weather around on Friday evening if you are doing anything for bonfire night. And then for the start of the weekend, some wetter conditions getting in to Scotland and Northern Ireland. A windy old day to come on Saturday across the board. Sunday, I think, the driest of the 2 days, and it should feel, well, rather like temperatures are back where they should be for the time of year, so a little milder in contrast to tomorrow. Sophie.
Susan, thank you. And that's it from us. Goodbye.